It was a cold winter morning when everything started. The streets were quiet, covered in fog. The sky was gray, and the wind was freezing. Most homeless animals were hiding, trying to stay warm. In a small house at the end of the street, an old man named Mr. Wilson was beginning his day. He lived alone ever since his wife passed away years ago. His life was simple: wake up, make tea, and sit by the window, watching the world go by. But that morning, something strange happened. As Mr. Wilson sipped his tea, he heard a soft sound at the front door. Thump, thump, thump. He frowned. Who could be knocking so early? Slowly, he stood up and walked toward the door. He rarely had visitors. In fact, most days he barely spoke to anyone. Curious, he looked through the small window beside the door. That's when he saw it. A dog. Not a big, scary dog. Not a pet with a shiny coat. A thin, dirty, tired-looking dog with no home. The dog wasn't barking. He wasn't complaining. He was knocking, lifting his paw and gently tapping the door. Thump, 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 thump. Mr. Wilson's eyes widened. A homeless dog knocking? Maybe it was an accident. Maybe he was just scratching. Shaking his head, Mr. Wilson sighed and turned away. He didn't open the door. He had seen plenty of homeless dogs before. Some looked for food. Others slept near houses for warmth. This one would leave soon. At least, that's what Mr. Wilson thought. But he was wrong. Because the next day, the dog came back. And again, he knocked. Thump, 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 thump. The same sound. The same quiet persistence. And again, Mr. Wilson ignored it. Then, the third day came. And once again, the dog returned, knocking, waiting, watching, never barking, never making a sound, just standing there, paw raised, knocking on the door like he belonged there. By now, the neighbors had noticed. "Mr. Wilson, that dog has been outside your house for days," one man said as he passed by. Mr. Wilson shrugged. "I don't know why. He just keeps knocking. Maybe he's hungry," an elderly woman suggested. Feeling a little guilty, Mr. Wilson placed a bowl of food outside. But the dog didn't eat. He sniffed it once, then looked back at the door. And he kept knocking. By the fourth day, Mr. Wilson started to feel uneasy. What did this dog want? Why wasn't he leaving? And more importantly, why did it feel like he was trying to say something? Then came day 5. That evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned dark, and the wind roared through the narrow streets. Cold rain began to pour, making everything wet and muddy. Yet when Mr. Wilson looked outside, the dog was still there, soaking wet, shivering, and still knocking. Thump, 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 thump. But this time, the knocks were weaker, slower. The dog looked very tired. His legs shook, his fur was completely wet, and his body trembled from the cold. And for the first time in 5 days, Mr. Wilson couldn't ignore him anymore. His heart tightened. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a hungry, lost dog looking for food. This dog needed help. And so, taking a deep breath, Mr. Wilson opened the door. As soon as Mr. Wilson opened the door, the dog did not run inside. He did not bark. He did not move his tail excitedly like most dogs would when someone shows them kindness. Instead, he just stood there. For a moment, Mr. Wilson and the dog locked eyes. The dog's eyes were deep, tired, and full of something unusual, something almost human. It wasn't just hunger. It wasn't just desperation. It was begging. It was as if the dog was asking for something. Mr. Wilson sighed and stepped aside. "All right, come in," he said quietly, feeling a little awkward. But the dog didn't move. Instead, he took a step back, and then another. Then, he turned around and looked back at Mr. Wilson, as if saying, "Follow me." Mr. Wilson hesitated. "What do you want, boy?" he asked. "You're not looking for food, are you?" The dog lifted his paw and gently tapped the ground. Then, he took another step away and waited. Mr. Wilson felt a strange chill. It was as if this dog had a purpose, a reason for being here. And for the first time in 5 days, Mr. Wilson felt curious. What would you do? Would you have followed the dog? Outside, the rain poured heavily. It was freezing cold. The wind howled through the empty streets, shaking trees and making shutters bang against windows. And yet, the dog kept walking, slow, steady, looking back every few steps, making sure Mr. Wilson was still following. Mr. Wilson hesitated at first. He was an old man. His legs weren't as strong as they used to be. His knees ached when he walked too far. And here he was, in the middle of a storm, following a strange dog to an unknown destination. But something inside him told him to keep going. 5 minutes passed, then 10. They walked past closed shops, through narrow alleys, over slippery roads covered in puddles. And then, the dog stopped, right in front of an abandoned construction site. Why did the dog bring him here? What was waiting inside? The sound that changed everything. Mr. Wilson squinted through the rain. It was an old, half-finished building. Broken bricks and wooden planks were scattered everywhere. The ground was muddy and covered in debris. For a moment, everything was silent except for the rain. And then, a sound. A soft, weak whimper. Mr. Wilson's heart froze. It was coming from inside the construction site. A tiny, desperate cry. Like a baby, but not a human baby. A puppy. Mr. Wilson turned to the dog, realization hitting him like a lightning strike. "You've been trying to tell me this all along, haven't you?" he whispered. The dog let out a soft whine and stepped forward. What would you have done in this moment? Walk away or step inside? Mr. Wilson's old bones ached, but he forced himself to move faster. He followed the dog deeper into the site, stepping over broken wood and piles of dirt. And then he saw them. 3 tiny puppies trapped under a fallen wooden beam. Their fur was soaked. Their little bodies shivered from the cold. They were too weak to move. Mr. Wilson's throat tightened. This mother dog had been begging for help for 5 days. Not for herself, not for food, but for her babies, for her family, and no one had listened. Until now. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with me. Mr. Wilson's breath sped up as he looked at the tiny, helpless puppies trapped under the heavy, heavy wood piece. The mother dog stood beside him, her eyes filled with worry. She let out a low, soft cry, as if begging with him one last time. He had to act fast. The rain continued to pour, making the ground slippery and difficult to stand on. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from urgency. "Hang on, little ones," he whispered as he bent down. Mr. Wilson rehearsed out and tried to lift the wooden beam, but it was too heavy for his old, tired arms. He pressed his teeth, took a deep breath, and tried again. It barely moved. The puppies let out weak cries. Their tiny bodies shivered with cold and fear. The mother dog pushed his arm gently, as if telling him not to give up. He knew he needed to think fast. He couldn't do it alone. "I need something to help me move this," he said quietly. He scanned the area and spotted a long metal rod lying nearby. It was rusty, but strong enough to act as a lever. With shaking hands, he grabbed it and placed firmly it under the beam. Pushing with all his strength, he felt the beam shift slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. One by one, the puppies started to crawl out, their tiny legs struggling against the mud. The mother dog quickly moved forward, licking them, nudging them closer to safety. Mr. Wilson took a deep breath. His heart pounded in his chest. He had done it. But this wasn't over yet. The puppies were free, but they were far from safe. They were cold, weak, shaking a lot because of the cold rain. If they didn't get warmth soon, they might not survive the night. Mr. Wilson looked down at his completely wet jacket. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He removed it and wrapped the puppies inside, shielding them from the rain. The mother dog moved her tail slightly, as if she understood what he was doing. Now, he had to get them home. But how? The streets were covered in puddles, and his house was far away. His old body was already exhausted from the struggle. Would he be able to make it, or had he taken on more than he could handle? With the puppies placed inside his jacket and the mother dog following closely behind, Mr. Wilson started walking. Each step was harder than the last. His legs hurt. His arms felt weak. The storm didn't let up. and the cold bit into his skin. But he kept going, because for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something truly important. The mother dog stayed by his side the whole way. Every few steps, she looked up at him, as if checking if he was okay. Step by step, minute by minute, they moved through the storm. And finally, after what felt like hours, Mr. Wilson saw it. His house. Warm. Safe. A place where these puppies might actually have a chance. His knees nearly gave out from relief. But as he stepped onto his porch, a new question filled his mind. What now? Mr. Wilson stood on his porch, holding the puppies close to his chest. The mother dog stayed right beside him, her wet fur sticking to her thin body. The storm still raged on, but he didn't care. He had brought them this far. But now came the hardest part. What would he do next? His house was small. He had barely enough food for himself, and he had never taken care of dogs before. For a moment, doubt crept in. Could he really help them, or had he made a mistake? But then, the mother dog did something unexpected. She nudged his leg gently and looked up at him, her eyes filled with something that made his heart ache. Trust, hope, gratitude. And in that moment, Mr. Wilson knew he couldn't let them go. He pushed open the door and stepped into his warm, dry home. The puppies let out soft whines, their tiny bodies still shaking from the cold. He quickly grabbed an old towel and began drying them off, one by one. The mother dog watched closely, as if making sure he was being gentle. Once the puppies were dry, he placed them in a small basket near the fireplace. The mother dog curled up beside them, wrapping her body around them for warmth. For the first time that night, they looked safe. Mr. Wilson sighed in relief and sat down in his old chair. His body was tired, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Then, a thought crossed his mind. What if no one had helped them? These tiny lives could have been lost forever, and no one would have even known. How many other animals were out there, waiting for someone to care? That night, Mr. Wilson barely slept. Every time the puppies made a small sound, he found himself checking on them. The mother dog didn't take her eyes off them either. She stayed awake, keeping them warm, licking their fur, making sure they were okay. It was strange. Just a few days ago, Mr. Wilson had lived in complete silence. His home had felt empty, like a forgotten place. But now, it was filled with life. Soft little breaths, tiny paws twitching in sleep. A mother's love so strong it could be felt in the air. And for the first time in years, Mr. Wilson didn't feel alone. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed your life forever? When the sun finally rose, the storm had passed. The streets were still wet, but the sky was clear and bright. The puppies woke up, stretching their tiny legs and letting out soft yawns. The mother dog licked each of them lovingly before turning to Mr. Wilson. It was a look of pure gratitude. And at that moment, he made a decision. They were not just visitors. They were family now. Mr. Wilson grabbed his coat and stepped outside. He needed supplies, food, blankets, maybe even a small bed for them. For the first time in a long time, he had something to look forward to. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change a life. Sometimes, an animal who looks lost is just looking for help. And sometimes, saving someone else can save you too. Mr. Wilson thought he was rescuing them, but in the end, they had rescued him just as much. Would you have opened the door? Would you have helped? Maybe there's a soul out there waiting for you, just like this mother dog was waiting for him. Next time you see an animal in need, what will you do?